Hi, I'm Rebecca Sugar. I'm here to talk about all things Stephen.
Well, Rebecca, thanks so much for sitting down and chatting. It's so great to sit down with you.
Yeah, you too.
So, to start, let's just talk about, I guess, your background. I know we have something in common. We both kind of grew up pretty close to each other. You're from Silver Spring, Maryland. I'm from Bethesda, Maryland. Talk about your childhood and growing up, and what were kind of the first moments that you remember where animation or storytelling kind of seeped into your life.
So animation was always a really big part of my life. My dad was a really big fan of animation, and so growing up, he would always be watching classic cartoons with us. My grandparents on my dad's side had VHSs of old Popeye cartoons, and Fleischer Superman, and my dad would have laser discs of the Looney Tunes that he would put on, but everything. We also had a laser disc of NFB shorts, of Canadian stuff. I had anime to watch when I was young, so I knew from a very young age. He also would have books around the house, like he had Chuck Jones's books. So I would read, Chuck-a-Muck as soon as I was old enough to, pour through that book. Yeah. Not that there's like an age cap on that book, but not really understand it. And books of Disney history. So it was always around, and I always understood. I don't think I ever thought that it wasn't drawing. Like I always understood that these were drawings, right? Because he would tell me, and it was something I always wanted to be able to do. And when I was really young, they signed me up for a camp at the Children's Museum in DC, an animation camp in the summer. So, I mean, I was a little kid. I'm not sure exactly how old I was, but I got to actually animate at this camp.
Wow.
As a kid. So I really appreciated it, even when I was young. And I wanted to know the names of everybody involved. I wanted to understand the difference between, Chuck Jones cartoons and Fritz Freleng cartoons and Fleischer cartoons, and, why Canadian cartoons seemed so different. And so that was really, really exciting to me. And I always wanted to do it. When I was in high school, I was also getting into comics. And I really wanted to be a comic artist. I really wanted to be a cartoonist and an animator. And I went to this program called the Visual Arts Center at Einstein High School. I went to Montgomery Blair High School and Einstein simultaneously, and to go to the CAP program at Blair and the VAC at Einstein.
I was down the street at Walter Johnson. So.
Right, yeah. So that was, I gave up. I was not a particularly popular high schooler, so it was fine for me to just give up my lunch period, where I would usually be alone listening to music on headphones anyway, and I would drive. Exactly. Me and my friend Robin, who was also doing the same thing, we would carpool from one school to the other so I could do the Visual Arts Center. And I would get in these very contentious fights with my teacher, who didn't consider the cartooning route as legitimate as the painting fine art route. Although he did like certain classic comics, but not what I was doing. He felt like I was doing something very derivative and uninteresting, and he wanted me to veer more towards painting. So I would, and I did. I painted, but I refused to give up comics. And I would be I tried to keep it alive in the center too, because he would be sometimes discouraging other people from comics too, and we would band together. And then eventually they did a Visual Arts Center comic, which made me really, really mad because he had been so against comics, and now realizing everyone was doing comics, they sort of co-opted those comics. Anyway, I was an angry teenager.
I can imagine.
But I wouldn't give it up, and I wanted to go to School of Visual Arts because they were almost like more of a trade school than an art school. Like you could just go in and start learning animation right away. And that's all I wanted to do. I didn't want the foundational year of charcoal drawing. I just wanted to animate as soon as I could.
Right.
So I ended up getting into SVA and going.
And you went to college in New York?
Yes, yes. School of Visual Arts is in New York City. And that's interesting too, because animation has roots in New York, has history in New York. The industry there is really small now, for a lot of reasons. There's no union there, which makes things difficult too. But that's where Fleischer cartoons existed. There's this history of also Jewish animation in New York City. That is really interesting to me. So it was exciting to be there and be in the city and also be animating immediately. And I met a lot of people right away in my first year freshman animation class that I would work with forever. Ian was the TA of that class.
Oh, wow.
My now husband.
Yeah, that's right. Congratulations, you guys recently got married.
Yeah, and Paul Valleco, who storyboarded on the show on Steven since the very beginning through the very end. We were classmates. That's where we met, was that first year class at SVA. And a lot of people came from SVA. Danny Hines, our original character designer, was Ian's year, and they were friends at school. And Kat Morris, who's also been on the show since the very beginning, she was my upperclassman. So
that's amazing.
Yeah, so we were all around each other. But Ben Levin, who was one of the writers on the show through the whole original run, who ended up creating Craig of the Creek with Matt Burnett. They were both at NYU, but they had a teacher who was also my freshman animation class teacher at NYU. And so my teacher in that first year class played Ben Levin's film for the class, which is called She's a Bombshell. It was my favorite film. I really loved it. And then later, when it turned out that he was writing for Level Up, and I was looking for writers on Steven, I got really excited about working with him because I loved his film, and we'd all had this same really tough teacher. His name was Matt Sheridan. He was a really, really brutal teacher, and one of my favorites. But right at the beginning, he'd just tear into you. Like, he'd have you do exposure sheets on the first day.
Wow.
Like the real not cute.
Yeah.
You know, a difficult part of animation.
Like boot camp.
Yes, and he'd hold up a drawing and be like, "Do you want your mom to put this on the fridge? Like, what is this? You know, like stop trying to draw pretty. Just try and make something that works," and things like that.
Right.
I really loved his class.
So, how did the journey come from, New York all the way out here? Did you get a job out here first and then moved out here, or did you just decide I'm coming to Los Angeles and then try to find work?
No, I was in New York. I was trying to find work in New York, and I was interning. Interns do a lot of there's no real rules there, so interns do a lot of free work. So I interned at World Bleeders, but I didn't get hired. I interned at Augenblick. A lot of my friends basically animated Super Jail while they were in college. So I wasn't on Super Jail, but I was at Augenblick for a little bit. But I couldn't land an actual job, so I was starting to get pretty nervous. I just graduated, and it was 2009, so everyone was worried job-wise.
It's a terrifying time. Like, you're in this little bubble of school, and then I remember when I left film school, it's like, now what? Like, what the hell are we gonna do? You know?
So I ended up hearing about. I had seen the Adventure Time pilot, and I was hearing about it sort of ramping up into a show, and that it had gone from Nickelodeon to Cartoon Network. And I loosely knew the character designer Phil Renda on the show, and he had come to speak at SVA because he was a graduate, and he had sent me a nice note on the internet because of some dancer drawings I had done. And then when he came to speak, I went over and I gave him some of my comics. I was still doing comics, just printing them independently. And he seemed surprised. He didn't realize that I was a student. He thought I was someone working. And so I think he ended up bringing my comics. I think they ended up at the studio here because I had given them to him. And then I also kept in touch with him while I was working on my student film because he was a professional that I really looked up to.
Right.
So then when they were testing for storyboards for Adventure Time, because they needed new storyboarders, he got in touch with me and sent me a test. So I did a test. I was in New York. I was in between jobs. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I did this test. I sent it in. I didn't hear anything for a little bit. And I remember I went to the Small Press Expo. I would always go to, there's a con in Maryland. Did you ever go to the Small Press Expo?
No, I remember you mentioned it to me one time, but no, because I was more kind of in filmmaking. I'm not fully in animation, so I wasn't really aware of the world when I was younger. But And I remember you say it was in Maryland?
Yes, it's in Rockville, and
Yeah.
I would always go since I was, I think, 15. So I went to SPX, and Penn was there.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't know what was going on. I think I actually went up to him and asked, oh, did you ever get my test? Which was pretty forward. I maybe shouldn't have done that. But he sort of said yes, and I think a little bit after that, I heard back that they were interested in hiring me as a revisionist. Not as a storyboard artist yet, but I'm glad that it was such a entry-level position, because you really have to learn the ins and outs of storyboarding. I didn't really know storyboarding. I'd made films and I'd done comics, but the way storyboarding worked at Cartoon Network was not something that I had really been able to study, except for the fact that it's a very traditional way to do it.
Right.
Which is, I suppose I had studied it in that I was reading those books about Chuck Jones, and I mean, really, the boarding that's happening here is so much like the boarding that was happening in, the 30s and 40s.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I understood it, but I didn't think it was a job that still existed.
Yeah.
So I came out, and when I was doing revisions, my mom helped me move. I got a little apartment on Bethany Road, and my brother actually still lives in the same complex because he moved out after me. And revisions was great because I was just fixing boards to make them functional. So all the gaps in my knowledge, like just how many poses you'd need to make something understandable to the team in South Korea, that was all I was getting a crash course in that, which was great. And then pretty shortly after, they asked if I wanted to be a writer storyboard artist, and it was a bit of a gamble because I was really new and no one was quite sure how things would turn out. So I just threw myself into it as hard as I could. And
was that nerve-wracking? Was that were you scared or anything, or did you just you were so gung-ho about it, you're just I'm gonna jump in the deep end?
I was excited.
Yeah.
After doing the test and realizing that the cartoonists were writing everything. I mean, it was a dream job to be able to write and to draw exactly what I meant. And then right off the bat, there was an episode with a song in it, so I got to work on the song. I wrote it was it came from the Nightosphere.
Yes.
And so that was the first song I wrote for TV. And at the time, I had not imagined I would ever have to pitch singing, so I really had to practice. At one point, when I got promoted to boarder, it made a space in the revisions team, and they were looking for a revisionist, and I was like, this artist that's really amazing, his name's Ian Jones-Cordy, you should maybe think of him for this spot. And then they brought Ian out to be revisionist.
Wow.
So he was there just as I was starting to board, and we would go up on the roof, and I would try to sing, a song, and then I'd just try to do it again louder, and he'd be like, just, one more, but just a little bit louder, and, until I could be, loud enough to be audible, basically, in the pitch.
Just building up confidence, essentially, right?
Yeah, because I was not used to, the pitching was the most, difficult part. Drawing and writing was what I loved to do.
Right, that comes naturally, kind of.
Pitching, it almost felt like extortion, like the ideas are being, held, and if you can't pitch it, then they'll all be killed. It's like I would have to. I didn't really do voices, but I would have to make it clear that I believed in all these ideas.
Yeah.
And sell them so that they could exist. And as much as I didn't want to perform or do any sort of public speaking, I had to in order to get it through.
It's a tough skill to learn and necessary though. But,
I didn't really have to pitch in college. It would be your film. You'd just make it, and then it would. You'd do everything, and then it would exist. You didn't have to convince anyone it was a good idea because you could just make it. But the selling of ideas is a huge part of working here. So that was a real learning curve. And also, the first episode was really tumultuous, and I did a whole version of it where the whole thing got scrapped. We were in our third week, and we were still redoing we had 4 weeks aboard. Now it's 5, then it was 4. And in the 3rd week, we were still overhauling huge portions of it. So it was really dramatic, I suppose. But it was my first episode, and I understand now that that's not too uncommon, especially for somebody's first episode.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we just redid it and redid it. I had started writing the Nightosphere episode that I had started pitching was more like a full musical with, you know, Lord of Evil singing and backup dancers and all this stuff all this Broadway stuff that later I would do a lot more in Stephen.
Of course, yeah.
And then Penn wanted to just pare it way down. All of that got scrapped, and it was basically like, if there's music in this, it should be this really intimate song between Marceline and Finn. And I hadn't thought of things that way before, so he really introduced me to just going smaller and how much power the smallness of something could have.
Absolutely.
And he sort of pitched an early version of the song, and then I just expanded on it for the Fry song. So it was great. It was such a huge learning experience, and I learned to not be precious right off the bat, because all of my stuff was getting thrown out.
Right.
Which I already understood, because I had the job of, you know, finishing loose thumbs that were all for scenes that had already been overhauled. Like, I was seeing it happen to other people's work, so I knew that's just how it went. Right. Especially early on. But, yeah.
So, I mean, you mentioned about music, and music is such a big part, and we'll talk about, of course, music and Stephen and everything, and you're a musician and songwriter and lyricist, and when did that kind of come early on to your kind of fascination with music and stuff, alongside animation?
Yeah, well, I mean, since I grew up with a lot of old cartoons, and a lot of old cartoons are basically vehicles to sell songs, you know, old Looney Tunes and the Silly Symphonies, the Betty Boop cartoons, you know, these things were built around music. So animation and music were never not linked in my mind. I think the funny thing about doing this now is, you know, in the old days, they'd have a song that they wanted to spread, and they would build a cartoon around it, and they would reinterpret it, and then they, you know, Warner Brothers would have that song, you know, on a record. Right. We didn't have that, so the only way to create that effect was to write original music, which was not really for the purpose of sort of selling it at the time or anything. It's just in order to have that traditional cartoon feel. Well, that's what I love about Stephen, is how music is part of the DNA of the show. And I mean, the first movie that my parents ever showed me, which I probably subconsciously would put me like really obsessed with music, was Fantasia. I mean, that's just like, it's just images and there's no dialogue. It's just images and music. And a lot of the old Looney Tunes, you know, Silly Symphonies, that's why I grew up on, like, when Chip and Dale didn't talk, you know, there was no dialogue. So, I mean, you know, before there could even be dialogue, people were playing music in the theater.
Exactly,
you know, the animation is that old. So it's very inexorably linked. And I like honoring that tradition. I think it's really incredible when all of those pieces combine.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's magical. So kind of rewinding a little bit, going back, talking about Stephen now, you know, you're here on Cartoon Network, you're working on Adventure Time. When did the seed for Stephen come? What was like the first idea for Stephen? Has it always been with you, and then you finally had the opportunity to pitch it? How did it kind of come to be?
Well, a little ways into Adventure Time, people at the studio became aware of my writing, and I think also my songwriting, because I started writing more and more songs. I think ended up writing, 17 songs for the show. I think it's 19 now, because I came back to write 2 more. So people were familiar with that. And so Curtis Leelash asked me if I wanted to pitch an idea, and I very much wanted to do that. I had always dreamed of having my own show. And so I didn't have the Stephen idea really before I was asked, but the drawings of Stephen, I'd been drawing, Stephen's based on my brother, and I'd been drawing my brother since our childhood. I would always draw pictures of Stephen. And I liked the thought of having everything revolve around that, because we'd grown up drawing together, coming up with ideas and working with Stephen and doodling Stephen, these were all sort of blended in my mind. And so I wanted to make something that felt like our childhood watching stuff and drawing stuff together.
Yeah.
So I liked the thought of having him at the center of it. But one of my thoughts was, Stephen is very Zelda influenced, specifically Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, which we used to play together. But that character, like Link in those games, would always be Stephen because he'd be playing. I liked the thought of him actually being the central character because in a way he always was in his fantasy stories.
Yeah.
So I also understood after working on Adventure Time just how much of your life would become devoted to this cartoon. If it were to get picked up, that it may be something I would end up working on for years and years, and it has been 8 years.
I know, it's almost a decade.
So I didn't want to build it off of something that I wouldn't continue to love indefinitely. So I knew that I had always enjoyed drawing my brother and would always like, making something dedicated to that time with him. So it felt like something I could commit to. So that's where I started. And then all of the fantasy elements of it, sci-fi elements of it, were all built around, it's a pastiche of the things that we used to enjoy and draw when we were younger.
Yeah.
So that was what I started with him, and then I went out from there, and each of the gems became a manifestation of some aspect of our relationship that we had with each other. So me being sort of able to be super free and casual around him, the ways that I would be sort of frustrated and overprotective and know it all around him, and also the sort of role model that I wanted to be for him. Those each just got separated out into a character.
Absolutely. And so when you're building that, I mean, is it? I think writing and creating anything it's a vulnerable thing. I mean, you're pulling stuff out of yourself and essentially putting it out there in the world. Did you find that as a vulnerable process at the beginning to be like, okay, I'm gonna have to dig deep and put myself on display in a way?
Oh, yeah. Well, I always liked doing that in my work. I wanted to make sure that it was personal, and from the beginning, Penn, when we were on Adventure Time, Penn and Pat and Adam would really encourage us to be very personal in our storytelling and to not hold back. And I found, just in a technical sense, ideas were more likely to get through if they were personal and raw and real. And if I did something phony, it would usually just get thrown out. So that was the way that I could get something through on that show, which is a very, very rare situation. I was very surprised, and I really had to dig not so much into when I wanted to go into animation, I wanted to make commercial stuff. I was not, in my mind there was independent comics where I was going to be able to really dig deep and do something experimental, and then there was animation where I just wanted to make the kind of cartoons you would see on TV. But on Adventure Time, I was not being asked to tap into that part. I was being asked to go the indie comics route and really dig deep, and I thought that was incredible. So I wanted to keep that alive. And Stephen, not just for myself, but also for my staff, really say, what do you want to say to millions of people? What would you want to put in this? How can we make something that's really authentic to us? Oh gosh, where did I start with this? What was the question?
Being vulnerable.
Being vulnerable, yeah. I mean, I'd had a little bit of it on Adventure Time. I'd put some really personal stuff into that show, and I'd seen the ripples that it made, and I really felt seen in a very shocking way when people would respond to some of the details that we were putting into that show, especially with Marceline as a character, because I was given a lot of room to put myself into her specifically, and that was really amazing. So I tried to do the same thing on Stephen, and I tried to have a sort of a thick enough skin to be able to withstand. It's tough when you're misunderstood.
Absolutely.
Sort of. Once it started airing, I think it became more difficult, and I definitely understood. I remember seeing Penn say, I can't look at the internet. I don't want to see that. And we would be, why not? Do you want to see? People are talking about it, and it's so funny. And look at this thing someone said. Isn't it ridiculous?
Right.
But it really is different when it's your show, and I really started to feel I did start to feel very exposed. People were writing very personal, uninformed things about me as a person, where I didn't, know what to do. And I always had, as a teen artist on the internet, I learned very quickly to not engage. I was used to, once people would know, get some sense of who I was already very vulnerable on the internet to pretty terrible comments.
Absolutely, but just like kind of going back to the start of the series, when you were talking about having this vision of unfolding slowly. When you started the series, did it take a while before you knew what the series was, or where? Did you always have an idea of where you're going? Like, oh, I want to get to this place eventually. And did it take? I guess you always see season 1 of shows feel very different than you feel like they hit their stride like season 2 and 3.
Yes.
Is that the same way in animation?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yes. I think one thing I also understood from Adventure Time is that the crew really makes the show. That the show creator, they're setting the tone, they're setting things in motion, they're approving everything, but that the people whose hands are on the stories, the people who can give it the most attention are the people that are writing and drawing it. And so I honestly, at the very beginning, before we were staffed up, I actively tried not to tie things down too much. I had a lot of plans, even from the pilot. I had everybody's fusions. I had doodles for characters that wouldn't show up until episodes after 100. But and I had a point, but I didn't have all of the details because I wanted to create that together. So there were certain things that came, really pivotal things that came later as we discussed it as a group. I think one of the biggest ones was the idea that Amethyst came later, that she was from the kindergarten. We came up with the concept of kindergartens together as a team. I sort of had the characters and their dynamics, but we really filled out the lore. And this was still early on. This was still back in 2013 that we were doing all of this as a team. But I wanted to make sure that we had created everything as a group, so that when we all split up and made these different parts of it, that it was ours. That we all had a stake in making it be what it is, and all were excited about how it was going to be doled out. And all felt like we were inside of it too. I didn't want it to just be my childhood with Stephen. I also wanted it to be Ian's childhood. I wanted there to be elements of Jeff's childhood and Lamar's childhood and Kat's childhood. Everybody, should have a home in it, is how I felt, especially because a lot of us loved animation but didn't actually, and we all aspired to make it, but we hadn't really had shows that felt like the lives we'd experienced growing up.
Exactly, yeah.
And some of that, I think, has been the most challenging part of making the show, is talking not only about the wonderful things about our childhoods, but also some of the really uncomfortable realities that many children face that just normally are not addressed. Even though we're addressing it through metaphor, there are a lot of children. I think there were a lot of things when I was young. For example, really casual anti-Semitism that I would experience when I was young. There was nothing like that in the cartoons I was watching, not as a metaphor, not as a surface level. I mean, anything. And it would be really isolating. You'd think, and sometimes you don't have other kids to talk about it with either. And certainly, as a queer kid, I had nothing to go on. I had no idea that any of the things that I felt at the time were relatable, that anyone else was experiencing that. I didn't really get to learn that until I was 27 or 28, and people were watching the show and saying I felt just like that. As a kid, I'd had no access to any sort of understanding that could be a part of a childhood.
Yeah, I mean, childhood is such no matter what race, gender, religion, orientation, it's a tough time. I mean, you're figuring yourself out, you feel alone, and you don't know what's really out there, and then you're seeing all these things and people reacting, and I'm so glad that Steven Universe exists, because I think it's so important because I remember growing up, you just look for something else to validate what you're feeling, and I think it's so important when you find that, and it's just like, oh, I'm not alone. Like, and it's like you don't feel comfortable talking to someone, but you just knowing somebody out there is experiencing it, I think, is so important. So.
I think that's true. Although I think that it does matter. I think all of those things do matter a lot. I think that when you're a marginalized kid, and there's not a lot of content being made by marginalized adults. There's a very specific kind of isolation that you feel. And especially with something as innocuous as cartoons,
right.
you know, that are just always in your living room and always in your house, to feel connected to those, but also feeling like I was personally an alien in a lot of ways, in the ways that I didn't connect with these things, or connecting with the wrong things, I think, especially as a kid, because I always liked the wrong shows. I never liked any of the shows for little girls. I always liked the shows that were aggressively marketed at little boys. And I lived with an understanding that that was totally incorrect, which was very confusing. And that was a big goal early on with Steven, was to make sure that when kids were watching it, they never felt like it wasn't for them. Like it was like there was never a signal that said, if you're this type of kid, this isn't technically for you. Even though the advertising still has to categorize everything that way, technically the show was designed or is marketed towards 6 to 11-year-old boys. Our demographic was 6 to 11-year-old boys. That was the only group we were supposed to care about. And the thing that was interesting for me was that I liked shows for 6 to 11-year-old boys. So I was going to get to make the thing that I wanted. But part of that, I wanted to also, as I was making that, say to the little me, you are also supposed to be watching this. This is not for you. But, you know, it's for them, but that's because that's what you like. You know, that seems fair, too. I think it's interesting. There's in the conversation about, I think, making more and more media for marginalized youth and helmed by marginalized creators. I noticed this a little bit in Spider-Verse too, which I think is an absolutely incredible movie.
Beautiful,
but then at the very end of the movie, there's a cap on it that says, you know, anyone can be Spider-Man. And I think that that's really funny, because the thing that's important about Spider-Verse is that the main character is Miles Morales. It's not anyone, it's him. So it's not a matter of making something that anybody can relate to. And which early on Steven, I felt like that's what we were doing. I was like, you know, anyone can relate to Garnet, anyone can relate to Amethyst, anyone can relate to Pearl. You know, everyone in our demo will be able to relate to these characters. But what I realized is that as a kid, I had been trained to relate to everyone, but a lot of people were, you know, when I was like, I want to be Batman, you know, I could make that leap and be like, well, in a lot of ways, this character isn't me, but I don't have a me, so I'll, you know, I like this, you know, but I think making Steven, what I really slowly realized, not only is it true that anyone can relate to these characters, but that I had not had the experience of just having someone who really, I could really put myself into in such a direct way. So yeah, I think it's all a lot more complicated.
It is. I would say it's not black and white. There's so many variations but I mean, that's the beautiful. That's why I love storytelling. It's because it comes from so many different people and different backgrounds and different paths, and it's like, oh, I can relate to what you're doing, even though it's not my path or something. I mean, I mean, that's why I fell in love with the whole thing. That's why I got into film and music and all that. So I mean, that's why I'm sitting here with you, I guess, in a sense. We're here together, you know.
I mean, animation is so amazing because the way that you can relate to a drawing is so fascinating, and you have to put yourself into that drawing. You know, I think, and that's one of the things that's exciting, I think, about Steven, is that, you know, in animation, since you see a lot of the similar types of characters, you know, people are seeing those characters, putting themselves into those characters, but you're not given an opportunity to relate to a lot of the characters, the types of characters that we have in Steven Universe. But you have to relate to an animated character when you see them, because they don't work unless you're doing that. You know, they're not real. They're not a real person. So you have to look at their face, at their eyes, and participate in the illusion that they're real. And the only way to do that is to fill in all of the gaps with yourself, basically.
Yeah.
There's a thing about it in Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud that talks about sort of the level of detail and how the less you have, the more you're filling that in with your impulse to relate. So when you look at a wall socket and you see a face, you know, you are trying, your brain's trying to see people everywhere. It's wired to empathize. And then the more specific it looks, the less you're putting yourself in, and the more you're seeing it as someone else. So a character like Finn is almost so blank a slate that it just becomes you.
Right.
In a lot of ways. The characters in Steven are a little more specific, but also no one quite looks, you know, like Pearl. Like
Right.
you have to sort of cross a cognitive bridge.
Yeah.
To see that face and understand it as a face.
And you don't realize your brain's doing that, though. You kind of like, yeah.
Right. It's very natural because we really want to understand one another. When we see a face have an expression, we want to know what that means. So, you know, we're very wired to do that.
Yeah.
And cartoons are just completely pulling on that impulse and giving you very abstract information to fire those synapses with. It's really interesting. And they're really symbols more. They're not people, they're symbols.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in sort of what we're saying semiotically and trying to navigate that.
Yeah, and also what we're doing in terms of animation here at Cartoon Network, which is, again, I feel like, I guess, dying art, I guess, 2D animation, hand-drawn, everything. I mean, all feature films they're all CGI. It's very rare to find. It's usually an art house picture that will do something 2D or, you know, hand-drawn. What's your take on it? What is your take on, I guess, animation right now in 2020 versus when you were growing up? And now it's like we're kind of holding on to this, you know, this last, I don't know, frontier of 2D animation, but it's thriving though. I mean, it's such an amazing thing that people, I guess, people outside the demographic don't really pay attention to. But
well, I used to be very concerned about the death of 2D animation. You know, when I was in high school, I remember when Treasure Planet was coming out and people were wondering, you know, is this going to do well, or is this going to be the end of this as a medium, and being worried about, I guess, 2D feature animation. I mean, so much 2D is still alive in television, and also what television is changing so much that it's very hard to say, but I feel certain at this point that it's, you know, there's no way that 2D animation is going away as long as there are people that are, you know, committed to making it. But I think I've also changed from being a real sort of purist and Luddite about animation. I did my whole student film on paper with, you know, pen and ink. Like I really, and Adventure Time, we were boarding all of our boards on paper. But now that I've done this work all these years, I've really changed. I'm at the point where if something can function and tell a story, I am impressed. You know, there's a lot of anime coming out now that's all digital, you know, that's all CG and, you know, cell shaded. And at first, you know, I was like, oh, you know, how could they? And now I'm just watching it. You know, it's like it reads, it's clear. I was watching a show called Welcome to the Ballroom, where they have the dancers in the foreground. They'll draw them traditionally, but then the background dancers will be CG. Just to fill out the room. And I mean, drawing someone spinning is really hard. And I think, you know, my teenage self would be appalled. But as a showrunner, I'm like, wow, that's so smart. You know, what a great idea. Look how
efficient that is.
If it functions now, I really love it. And I think that, you know, again, with Spider-Verse, the way that technology is being used to create the effects of mediums, make something look like comics, you know, have predictive technology that is, you know, moving what reads as line work, even though it's technically CG. All of this I find to be very interesting solutions, and I really don't fear that hand-drawn animation will ever go away, but I think that I'm more excited than ever about all the possibilities and the ways that traditional looks can be reinterpreted and celebrated digitally, I think it's really exciting. So I just like everything now. I've really mellowed out.
You just embrace the change, you know.
Yeah.
I want to kind of rewind back and kind of refocus on Steven, based on just, we were talking about music earlier, and so music is such a big part of Steven Universe, the show, the movie, what Steven Universe Future is. Was that always the plan? Was it always to have songs? And I mean, also your score too with your composer is fantastic. I mean, so great, which is, I think, special on a 11-minute program like that. Was that always the idea from the start, to make sure that music was kind of part of the show's DNA?
Oh yeah, I mean, we wrote it into the story. Steven his dad is a rock star. Yeah. His mother is rose quartz in all the ways that she's complicated. But part of the point of Steven was always that he was getting a lot from his dad's side, not just his musical talent, but also his compassion and his sensitivity, like all that's coming from Greg. So we wanted that to be a part of who he is as a character.
Yeah.
And I always wanted there to be a musical theater component to the Gems. When we originally did all of our auditions, everybody sang for the part. So I wanted to make sure that even long before people would sing, that they would have, I knew they would all eventually sing. So I wanted to
make sure they were good.
to tee that up. And I wanted their ways of singing to complement each other. It was important to me that everyone was coming from wildly different places and experiences, and on the crew, but also in the cast.
Yeah.
So to have this core cast with, Dee Dee, who's coming from musical theater, who was in Wicked, who, was Miss Saigon.
Yeah.
And then Michaela, who was a dinosaur on Barney, and then Estelle, who's an international superstar.
Right.
I wanted the way that they interacted and complemented each other to be a part of the feeling of the show. And eventually you would find out, these different types of gems would not usually be interacting in this way.
Yeah.
Story-wise, but I wanted you to feel it from the very beginning that this was this sort of special situation where these people from these different backgrounds were together. And that was really exciting. And then also in terms of just the staff working on the show, we're all very different from one another in so many ways, but also I didn't want only a certain type of fan.
Yeah.
So, I would have people working on the show who were coming from Canada, who were into Canadian animation, who were big anime fans, who were like fans of, Schoolhouse Rock 70s stuff. I wanted to find a way for the show to look and feel that had a home for all of these things. So, if someone who liked Canadian stuff drew Pearl with all those signifiers, with the nose and with the hair, but bent it in a way that could feel more like what they like, that there was room for that. So that was, I wanted to create a home for a lot of different schools of thought. And then we could all learn from each other, too.
Absolutely, yeah. And complement each other. I want to talk about meeting, how did you find, you have two wonderful composers, Aivi and Surasshu, who just do an amazing job with the music on your show and the movie. How did you discover them or meet them, and how did you bring them on board for this journey?
We did tests for the music, and I had been introduced to their stuff by Jeff Liu, who also writes a lot of music with me on the show. He sent me some of Aivi's YouTube videos. And so we reached out to them, and they did a test, which really blew me away. Just had such a warmth to it, and I was like, it's got to be them. So I started working with them, and at the time it was really interesting because Aivi was in Oakland, but Surasshu was actually in the Netherlands, and we would Skype, and it would be morning, and it would be 10 at night, but it would be morning for him.
Right.
And I may be getting where he was exactly wrong. This was like 8 years ago.
Yeah.
But we would all be sometimes when I would have to travel for work, like I would go to New York for a con or something, I'd be Skyping, and we would just the three of us would be in completely different time zones. I remember I did a music Skype from Korea where it was really hard to figure out what time we could all do it. But it was great. I mean, they're brilliant. So it's been great from the very beginning. And they're so amazing at taking demos from me that are so not figured out, just really, really rough, and then just my thoughts about it and just translating that into such a developed piece that's so far beyond, my wildest dreams.
Yeah. And what you guys did for the movie was, I mean, fantastic. I mean, we can talk about the movie a little bit, and what you really embraced as a old school musical. I mean, really throwing back to what the genre is and theater and everything, and talk about, I guess, what was the process of mapping the songs out? Did you figure out the arc of the story first and go, well, we need a song for this moment, or do you I know where the songs need to be for? I mean, I guess I'm jumbling, but what's the process for that and mapping that out?
Yeah. I had the idea. I had the rough idea, and I had the songs, just like you're saying, I had the songs on a sheet of paper, which ended up being different in the final, but I had like a rough draft of we'll start with this kind of song. I always wanted it to be a book opening since the very beginning, and start with certain types of numbers. So I knew I want to start with one of these really indulgent Disney openings, and have that move to this more Steven Universe-y celebratory song. Okay, so but at the time I thought there were going to be 14 songs. There ended up being 16. So I had the basic framework for the story. I had I think a beat sheet that I had presented that was sort of approved but not really, which was dangerous to be working on the music. But I had to work on the music then because I had asked for 6 weeks to put post on hold so that I could just write the music. And getting all of it done in 6 weeks was really scary. It usually takes me at least a week to write a song. So writing 14 songs in 6 weeks was not something that I was used to doing. And then it became 16 later because when they started coming together, I realized that certain aspects were missing and that we needed to cover, I think, and I also have to write multiple drafts of a song usually to do it. So there were several versions that got thrown out in addition to the 16 final songs. There's a song called Forever that got thrown out. It's an early version of a business song that didn't exist. So I had this list, of the intro, the outro. I had the team. The other thing that was really scary during the movie is that we were finishing Change Your Mind, which means that our writer storyboard artists were all rolling off of the show.
Right.
And I needed to write this music before we could make the movie. But my team was all leaving, so I got us a place out in Topanga and invited as many people who could come, and also the composers came down, Aivi and Surasshu, and pitched them everything that I had so far, which was very rough. And then we just did this massive brainstorm over basically a day and a half, which got me closer to the final story enough to really start thinking about what the music would be. And having Steven and Aivi there, Aivi and Surasshu there from the very beginning was really helpful because we weren't just talking about the story beats we had to hit, but also the style of music that each song could be, and they were pulling references. I like to have a bunch of references. But I hit the ground running with this list of the 14 when the 6 weeks started. Immediately went to see Estelle. We talked about the Garnet song that we were going to do together. She helped me pull together a plan for going to see Chance because that's where I was going next. And she said, you can't go there with nothing. So we started coming up with True Kind of Love together and made a really early draft of it, which just in her personal studio.
Yeah.
And then I think the next day I went to see Mike Kroll. I mean, every day I was going to see someone different. I went to see Mike Kroll. We talked about what we were going to do with his song, and he played me some songs, instrumentals that he had written that I could potentially sort of adapt to one of them, which ultimately we did. I flew to Chicago. I went to Chance's studio and worked on True Kind of Love, which completely changed once we were working on it together. And we were also working with Macy Stewart. I flew back. I actually ended up going to Lake Tahoe with my family. And I thought they had planned this trip earlier. And so I thought, well, I'll go, but I'll be working on, I'll just like find a spot in the woods or something to work on the music. But it ended up being extremely hard to work. So
escape,
I had a hard time getting things done, although I did a lot of drawing there because I was also drawing the early concepts for Spinell while I was writing the music. And so the second I was done being with my family, I rented a little Airstream in Malibu to just go be completely alone because I was like, everyone's got to please leave me alone, and just started recording everything that all the rough thoughts I'd had. And then Jeff Lou came out to Malibu with me, and we wrote Here We Are in the Future, and at the same time I was writing Isn't It Love and recording Tale of Stephen and recording Drift Away, and then I sent Drift Away to Amy Mann, and then when I got back from the Airstream, she actually came over to my house, and she had written the bridge for it already based on the demo I had sent, and then we recorded the whole thing. And then I flew to Rhode Island, and I was working with Ted Leo, and then I think I have this wrong. I think I went to Rhode Island first, and then I came back and met with Amy Mann. But it was just a whirlwind, and my adrenaline was just surging the whole time, because I knew from my own experience that I'd never been able to get songs done that fast.
Right.
So the wildest one was I actually found in a dream. I didn't write it in a dream, but I had a dream where I was watching footage of it playing.
Wow.
And then I woke up and I recorded it, and it's a chunk of it is pretty much exactly the same as what I had heard. And the weirdest thing is I've been trying to come up with a counterpoint for Let Us Adore You, which I'd just been working on with Jeff Lou. I was also back and forth to his house a lot. And we took the song I'd heard in my dream, played it over it, and it functioned, which was just bizarre. But so I think I must have been trying to come up with a counterpoint to the point that where I fell asleep. And but that's, I couldn't, it was invading everything. I was working in my sleep, I was working when I was awake. And then I finished, I think I finished 14 in the time, but realized that there were 2 that I still needed. We didn't have Pearl's reboot auto song yet. I just had the instrumental for it, but not the lyrics, and I didn't have Change. I only had this really early concept for Change. So those 2 happened while we were boarding, and everything else was done in advance. And I would go up to Stephen and Ivy's too, to Aivi Surasshu's, and I did a lot of demos directly with them. I would bring the rough stuff that I recorded with Jeff Lou, I'd bring it up to them, and then we would refine it. It was just a mad dash.
I remember just from my perspective, for anyone's listening, I work at Carte Network Studios too, so, but it just from production systems and overseeing everything, I'm just like, it kept me busy too, so, but it was just fascinating. It was just seeing all the creativity pouring in that amount of time. The adrenaline's rushing, the deadlines are there, but I interview a lot of composers, and some of their best work comes when they have literally no choice but to kind of go with the gut instinct and just kind of dive in.
It was definitely like that.
Yeah.
And I think it worked out. Once we still had time to tweak lyrics and stuff while we were boarding, but it was great. I learned a lot. I learned a lot.
Yeah. So just kind of reflecting on it all. What would, right now we're in Steven Universe Future, which is 10 episodes are going to be premiering soon. At this point in the show's life, what would you tell season 1 Rebecca what would you tell season 1 Rebecca who's just starting on this journey?
I think I would there's a lot of things. I don't know if season 1 Rebecca would have listened to me.
Really?
If I said the sort of basic, trust yourself, don't be so hard on yourself, there's no way.
Yeah.
I think maybe I would tell myself like that you're going to be able to make the whole thing, because that was something that we didn't know, and it was there was so much anxiety over if we'd actually get to finish the story we were writing, because it had to unfold in a certain way, and certain things got crunched and certain things got stretched because of when I would be told you are getting more or you're not getting more. And so, yeah, it would have been nice to know that
you wouldn't be able to, like, don't worry, you'll finish it.
That we were going to be able to finish it, and we would build in these trapdoors in case we didn't have any. You know, Ocean Gem could have been the last episode, and so we wrote it that way. Change Your Mind. I asked for an additional 6 episodes on the end of that season because people were so sure that there would not be more, that I was basically told to end it, and I couldn't in that short amount of time. Like we needed more room, but the rhythm of it, you can feel us start to rocket toward the finish line. So, and then finding out, it was very uncertain if I'd get to make the movie, even while we were working on it, even while we were deep into it. I was constantly being reminded of the very real possibility that it just wouldn't happen. And I really care about these stories and these characters, and so that it was a lot of unnecessary pressure. If I could go back and know, they'll make, if I could go to the start of the movie and say, you'll finish it, like the schedule will be bizarre and ridiculous, but you will get to finish it and people will get to see it. It's rough to be working on something and not know if it'll ever see the light of day.
Yeah, I mean, just the television landscape it's so many different variables and one of my favorite shows is Scrubs, and I always listen to Bill Lawrence speak about how they thought, but they switched networks and everything. He did the same thing with Cougar Town. Just like you have this vision and everything, but I mean, I'm glad everything worked out because it's such a beautiful show, and I'm so glad it exists in the world. So thank you for bringing it to us. And just to kind of wrap things up, if you had any advice to someone sitting in their room right now listening, wanting to venture into animation or filmmaking or writing, whatever, what kind of advice would you give somebody?
Wow. I would say start immediately. Like, don't wait for permission. At any moment, especially now. I mean, you could be a filmmaker with your phone. You can do storytelling. There's so many ways you can just sit down and start animating. I feel like it helped me a lot to have done independent comics. I was able to explore a lot of ideas that way that I would end up using in my later work. And also, it just gave me the experience of writing and drawing for characters and then having people read it and tell me what they didn't understand. I think it's impossible to get into this line of work and have what you're doing be the first time you're doing it. You need to have had some experience. So the sooner you can start just making stories and putting them out there, the better. I think it's also let's see, how do I put this? This is, personally, I really like it when I see a project change from start to finish. When I see an art style develop, when I see, the writing and when I see the character's arc, but I also see the artist arc. That's the best. That's my personal feeling. I am not a fan of consistency to the point that it crushes personal expression and personal growth. So I would say, personally, I would love to see anyone who's getting into any of these mediums feel the freedom to develop within their project. When I start something, I want to be drawing differently and writing differently when I finish. And I wouldn't want to sacrifice that opportunity for consistency. Not everyone agrees with that, but I really strongly feel that an amazing piece of artwork has that experience trapped inside of it.
Yeah, for
puts
sure.
you somewhere else when you're done. So that would be my other piece of advice, is to let yourself grow, even if it means that the last page of the comic or the last scene you shoot has a different quality than the first one. I think that is really critical.
Absolutely. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for sitting and chatting. This was so enlightening and fun, and getting to hear your story. So appreciate sharing.
Sure, thanks.